In India, there's this one proposed law that's causing a massive stir. It's threatening to completely redraw the country's political map, and in the process, it's pitting two fundamental democratic principles against each other. It is a super high-stakes reshuffle, and it all boils down to just one word: delimitation. And, to really get a handle on how big a deal this is, we're not going to start with the law itself. Nope, we're going to start with the explosive reaction it's already getting. That's a pretty powerful statement, right? It's from M.K. Stalin, the chief minister of the southern state of Tamil Nadu, and he didn't just call it a black law, he's framing it as a full-on attack on India's federal structure and the very identity of his state. And those words, they lit a fire almost immediately. Black flag protests started popping up all across Tamil Nadu. Some leaders are even promising to take this fight all the way to the Supreme Court. So what on earth is in this bill that's causing such a fierce backlash?
This whole controversy, this whole firestorm, it all revolves around this one crucial process: delimitation. So let's break it down. What exactly is it?
To put it simply, think of delimitation as hitting a giant reset button on a country's election map. You see, as populations grow and people move around, this process redraws the lines for voting districts. It decides how many representatives each part of the country gets in the national parliament, which is called the Lok Sabha. The basic idea is the more people a state has, the more seats it gets. But here's the big twist. In India, this whole process has been intentionally put on ice for almost 50 years. Way back in 1976, leaders saw this divide happening. The northern states had these booming populations, but the southern states were actually doing a great job controlling population growth. So to avoid, penalizing the South with fewer seats for their success, the government just froze the number of Lok Sabha seats at 543. That freeze got extended again in 2002, basically kicking the can down the road until at least 2026. So you gotta ask, right? If this freeze has been in place for decades to keep the peace, why is the government suddenly pushing to change it now? Well, they've got two main reasons they're pointing to. The first big reason is this landmark new law, one that's been debated for ages. It's a bill that reserves 1/3 of all seats in parliament for women. This is a huge and honestly a long overdue step for gender equality in Indian politics. But here's the math problem. If you keep the total number of seats at 543 and then set aside 1/3 of them for women, you're massively cutting down the number of seats available for male candidates. So the government solution is pretty simple. Just make the pie bigger. Increase the total number of seats in parliament, and that way women get their reserved spots, and you still have plenty of seats for the male MPs. The second argument is all about the quality of democracy itself. Right now in India, a single member of parliament represents, on average, a staggering 2.5 million people. Just to give you some perspective, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives serves about 750,000 people. I mean, the argument is, how can one person possibly represent the needs of millions of people effectively? So the proposal is to increase the total number of seats from 543 to as many as 850. This would bring that representation ratio down to about 1 MP for every 1.5 to 1.8 million people. So on the surface, it sounds like a win-win, right? Better representation and a clear path for women's reservation. So why the protests? Why call it a black law? Well, this is where the political math gets explosive. You see, the core fear from the opposition, it isn't really about the number of seats. It's about how this change would fundamentally shift the balance of power across the entire country. Okay, let's look at how power is distributed right now. The populous northern states, often called the Hindi heartland, they hold about 38% of the seats. South India has just over 24%. Just keep those numbers in your head for a second. Now look at what happens in a projected 850-seat parliament, where seats are reallocated based on today's population. The Hindi heartland's share jumps up from 38% to 43%, and South India's share, it shrinks from over 24% down to just under 21%. So while every state gets more seats in total, their relative power, their voice in parliament, changes dramatically. And that is exactly why Southern leaders feel like they're being punished. They're being punished for the very thing the 1976 freeze was meant to reward: their success with population control. Their biggest fear is that their political influence will be watered down so much that the North could pass laws without needing a single vote from the South. It basically brings that old fear of a federal imbalance, the one that was frozen 5 decades ago, roaring back to life. And this brings us right to the heart of the dilemma. This isn't just some political squabble. It's a fundamental clash between two core ideas of what a democracy should be. On one hand, you have the principle of representation. One person, one vote, one value. This idea says you absolutely should reallocate seats based on population so that every single vote carries the same weight. But then, on the other hand, you have the principle of federalism. And that idea says that to hold a huge, diverse country together, you have to protect the voices of the smaller states to make sure they aren't just drowned out by the bigger ones. And that leaves us with this massive question. India is caught between these two ideals, making sure every citizen's vote is equal and making sure every state's voice is heard. So when two core democratic principles clash head-on like this, how does a nation choose? Is there a middle path, or does one ideal have to give way to the other?